The snow was slowly falling from the sky, as if someone had spread a blanket of silence on the ground. The white fields stretched far and wide, where the rows of trees were lost in the mist and seemed to be part of an unfulfilled dream. There was such a chill in the air that it pierced the chest with every breath. In the middle of the deserted pasture stood a wooden fence, and a woman tied to it sat on her knees. Her wet hair clung to her face, her clothes were dirty and torn, and on the snow near her lap, 3 little souls were shivering in white clothes. 3 daughters, 3 little breaths that were fighting the cold. The woman's name was Elizabeth, once a playful girl in a small Texas town. After marriage, her world was confined to the walls of a deserted farmhouse. Her husband, Harold, was harsh, stubborn, and blinded by his desire for a son. He remained silent at the birth of his first daughter. His eyes filled with hatred at the birth of his second. And when his third daughter was born, his anger turned to madness. "I wanted an heir, not weakness." His words still rang in Elizabeth's ears. He beat her, pushed her. How? Not mind, and finally threw her out of the house in the cold night and tied her to a fence so that she would regret her mistake. The snow was freezing on her shoulders, but Elizabeth's eyes were on her daughters, Emma, Sophia, and little Grace. Their lips were turning blue. Their breathing was slowing. Elizabeth tried to free herself from the ropes, but her hands were numb. Tears were freezing in her eyes. She knew that unless a miracle happened, this night could be their last night. In the same wilderness, a man was walking at a distance. Tall, with a thick coat, snow-covered boots, and a strange seriousness in his eyes. His name was Jacob. People called him the Lonely Rancher. He had a large but deserted ranch in this part of Montana. Many years ago, his wife and newborn son had been killed in a car accident in a snowstorm. Since then, he had cut himself off from people. His heart was as desolate as the snowy plain. Jacob had gone out to see his cattle that night when he heard the faint sound of a child crying in the distance. At first, he thought it was an illusion, but the sound reappeared. He moved in the direction of the sound and stopped when his eyes fell on the scene: a woman tied to a fence and 3 little girls on the snow. Surprise and anger flashed across his face. He rushed forward, knelt down, and lifted the girls into his arms. "Who did this?" His voice was harsh. Elizabeth's lips were trembling. "My husband. One. He wanted a son." The words came out in broken pieces. An old wound flared in Jacob's eyes. He remembered his lost son and the moment when he last saw his wife. He immediately took out a knife and cut the ropes. Elizabeth fell to the ground lifeless, but he immediately saw his daughters. Jacob wrapped the girls in his coat to keep them warm. "You are coming with me," she said firmly. The sentence contained both a command and a promise of protection. He took them to his car. The warm air from the car heater brought back a little life. Jacob drove the car towards his ranch. There was silence all the way. Only the weak sobs of the girls could be heard. Elizabeth had both fear and an unknown hope in her heart. Upon reaching the ranch, Jacob immediately lit a fire, pulled out blankets, and prepared hot milk. He called Mary, a nurse from a nearby town, who arrived shortly after. Mary checked on the girls and said that if they had not been brought in time, they might not have survived. Tears began to flow from Elizabeth's eyes. The next day, Harold came to the ranch in a rage. There was terror in his eyes. "She's my wife," he shouted. Jacob stood in the doorway. "A wife is not an animal you can tie up in the cold," he said coldly. A silent tension settled between the two. Harold threatened, but Jacob's strong presence and determined eyes forced him to back down. The town sheriff was notified, and Harold was taken away with a warning. Time slowly began to change. Elizabeth began to live on the ranch. At first, she would startle at every sound, fear every shadow. But Jacob's demeanor was quiet but kind. He would make wooden cradles for the girls, warm milk, and wake up at night when they cried. For the first time in her lonely life, the sounds of life began to resonate. Emma's eyes were blue, Sophia's cheeks were rosy, and Grace's smile filled Jacob's heart with light. He couldn't keep himself away from them. Sometimes he would watch the snow falling outside the window and think that maybe nature had given him a second chance. A few months later, spring came, the snow began to melt, and greenery appeared. Flowers bloomed around the ranch. Elizabeth's face also regained its color. She looked strong now. She began sewing and socialized with the women of the town. Jacob prepared a separate room for her, but somewhere in his heart, he knew that she had now become a part of the house. One evening, as the sun was setting and the sky was bathed in orange light, Emma tried to walk with her little feet and fell. Jacob immediately ran to pick her up. At that moment, Elizabeth saw her, her eyes filled with the compassion of a father. A strange tenderness came into her heart. A strange tenderness came into her heart. The town was abuzz with gossip. People said that the lonely rancher had changed. He who never spoke to anyone now, smiled, and greeted people in the market. Girls would hold his finger and walk with him, and he would proudly join them. But the past doesn't easily leave its mark. Harold filed a lawsuit in court, claiming that Elizabeth and the girls were his property. Jacob was furious, but Elizabeth held his hand and said she was no longer weak. In court, she described everything: the beatings, the humiliation, the cold night. Mary testified, and the sheriff also confirmed. The verdict was in Elizabeth's favor. Harold was convicted, and Elizabeth was given custody of the girls. That day outside the courthouse, Jacob held the girls in his arms and smiled openly for the first time. Time passed. The ranch was no longer lonely. There were sounds of laughter, the sound of small footsteps, and stories around the fire in the evening. One day Jacob placed a small wooden box in front of Elizabeth. It contained a simple ring. There was a tremor in his voice, but faith in his eyes. Tears welled up in Elizabeth's eyes, but this time they were tears of joy, not of fear. The story of the snowy night that had brought the message of death had now become the foundation of life. The three daughters, once a cause of hatred, were now a symbol of pride. Jacob bought horses for them, taught them to read and write, and every year on their birthdays, he invited the whole town. Years later, when Emma gave a speech on the school stage and said, "My dad is the bravest person," Jacob's eyes welled up with tears. He remembered that cold night. That snow. With nothing, Dad. Snow. And the words she had said. You're coming with me. Little did he know that those words would not only save 3 lives, but also find refuge in his own desolate soul. It still snows occasionally outside the ranch, but it's always warm inside. Elizabeth often looks out the window and is deeply grateful that a stranger stopped that night when he heard a voice. If those footsteps hadn't stopped, this story might not be happening today. Life tested them, broke them, but then brought them together again. Life tested them, broke them, but then brought them together again. And in this desolate pasture, where once there was only cold, now there is a haven of love.